hunting for fish and for whales. NES Works episode 162 is all wet. I've been looking forward to the black bass for quite a while. It's not that I have any particular interest in 8-bit fishing games, but rather because this game once held the distinction of being the most expensive second-hand NES game on the market, and I've been dying to know why. But I first became aware of the Black Bass USA during the NES days, not through a rental, or because everyone at school was gushing about the game and swapping it around our Friendland network, but rather because of the Funco trade circulars that allowed NES fans to mail in their used games for cash or trades at a massive loss. I can't seem to find scans of the specific publications that I'm thinking of on the internet, but for a while, circa 1991-92, Funco offered a massive sales bounty for the Black Bass, offering enough in trade that you could actually buy a brand new NES cartridge with the loot. That didn't last too long, and eventually the price came down and was eclipsed by second-hand offers for Capcom's Black Tiger, which of course never actually shipped for NES. But seeing someone offer something like $60 for a used game set my mind reeling and my imagination racing. What kind of game could this be? Was that bass as in fishing or bass as in music? Was this some kind of Dragon Warrior-like game where you had to go on an adventure? Already at that point, battery-backed role-playing type games commanded a premium at retail due to the cost of the components and the extra-sized ROM chips. My brain conjured up visions of something in the vein of the Black Onyx, not that I'd ever heard of that game back then, an intriguing journey to save a mythical kingdom, probably as a sort of counterpart to the White Lion, now that I think about it. Anyway, imagine my disappointment when the Black Bass turned out to be the most prosaic thing you could have come up with for that title. A game where a guy goes out fishing and tries to catch a black bass. It's not an especially massive game, it has no battery backup, and it's somehow even uglier than Dragon Warrior. Though that's not surprising, since it was seemingly developed by a studio called Another. We've seen Another's work on the dreadful Monster Truck over on Game Boy, but they really established their reputation by creating one of the worst Famicom Dragon Quest clones of all time, the infamous Stargazer, aka Hoshi Omirohito. So why the premium Funco markup? Probably just rarity. Like I said, this was not a game I saw crowding the shelves or burning up the pages of Nintendo Power or dominating after-class conversation. As an unbelievably niche game from a brand new licensee for the NES, a company called Hot B, I have to imagine that the Black Bass USA, as it's formally called, was produced to Nintendo's minimum order quantity. Anecdotally, I've heard from peers and readers over the years that this game caught on big outside of the core NES audience. Your mom and grandpa loved Tetris and Dr. Mario, but your uncle wanted an NES so that he could play this fishing game. However accurate all of this may or may not be, it certainly does add up to a scenario in which the Black Bass exploded into a sleeper hit as demand exceeded its meager supply, and the buyers at Funco Land were so driven by the desire to get their hands on stock that they were actually willing to pay a generous price for cartridges, which anyone familiar with Funco's practices will know was a historically rare event. Funco Land, of course, was a used game seller with big ambitions. They began as a single location, but the business took off as they advertised in magazines to encourage kids to mail away their used games and trade, usually offering buy-sell rates that amounted to exchanging 2 or 3 carts for one, and soon became a nationwide chain that published its own newsletter, which, strangely enough, is one of the last American games magazines available today at newsstands, Game Informer. Funco Land was eventually purchased by Electronics Boutique, which was then folded into GameStop, which means that, while ailing, Funco is still around. I don't think they care much about the Black Bass USA today, though. But still, would we even have meme stocks without this game? Sorry for the digression here, but the truth is that I don't have a lot to say about the Black Bass. Fishing games don't do much for me. But its presence on the NES speaks to the console's explosive popularity in 1989. This is another of those games that moves away from the typical console fare and didn't court the typical console audience. And it clearly did well enough for itself that it became a hot ticket. A hot B ticket, as it were. Hot B had actually helped to invent the fishing genre. The original Black Bass appeared on MSX computers back in 1984, and the NES cartridge was the third entry in the series after a Japan-only Famicom title, also called the Black Bass. or fourth entry if you count the 1987 release of The King Salmon for PC 88. The workings of the Black Bass USA more or less locked down the way the fishing genre would play out over the decades. You find a spot to set up camp, cast a line, and attempt to attract a fish to bite. If you've played the fishing events in order to build up your Animal Crossing museum, you'll get the gist of this one. Once you cast your line, you wait for a fish-shaped shadow to appear and bite the lure. Then reel it in by pumping the A button while trying to avoid getting the line snagged on scenery. The black bass is a lot more granular than Animal Crossing's minigame, of course. You can choose to set yourself up at any point in a little lake, and the particulars of the scene vary depending on your location, ranging from open water to a reed-choked marsh. You can select from several different types of lure in different colors, waggle the lure to make it look more delicious, and use a golf-like meter to determine the power and distance of your cast. There are 4 or 5 different kinds of fish to catch, all of which vary in size, with your objective, of course, being to haul in the biggest possible specimen of each species. You can record your progress with a password, and once you conquer your first lake, there's apparently a Japan course. I say apparently because I sure do not have the patience, not to mention free time, to master the particulars of the Black Bass USA. Sorry, I'm the wrong kind of uncle. This is for the afternoon Budweiser and fishing uncles. Me, I'm more of an evening martini and turn-based RPG kind of uncle. As long as the RPG is not Legend of the River King. Thanks. Sometimes you're reminded of the fact that content standards and restrictions have really tightened up in certain areas over the years. Case in point, Casino Kid, a game about a young man who wanders a casino, gambling and chatting up bunny girls. Like the Black Bass USA, Casino Kid demonstrates just how varied the NES has become here in 1989. We're still a long way from the blue ocean appeal of Nintendo's Wii and DS era, but you can see those seeds being sowed here. Call it the Blue Lake strategy. Thanks, Black Bass. The mainstreaming of the NES felt different from the way the Atari 2600 had gone wide. There was a sense of faddish novelty about the 2600 during its heyday, like it was the next funny and slightly embarrassingly goofy 1970s trend, a la Pet Rocks. Here, nearly a decade later, the entire concept of computers and electronic entertainment had matured considerably. A whole lot more American households owned personal computers than they had in 1981, and the vocabulary of video games had shifted from weird, trendy jargon to become fully normalized. Again, anecdotally, the NES had become something that families purchased for the kids, but adults would often find some experience that drew them in and began treating it as a hobby as well. More of a diversion than a passion, but there was a real sense of the NES as the family amusement device depicted on the console box art that video games would lose touch with during the 16 and 32-bit eras. All of this is to say that Casino Kid doesn't strike me as the kind of game that was really intended for children. You assume the role of a young man here, yes, but the entire game consists of playing poker and blackjack, making wagers, and talking to bunny girls. Now, I have no doubt that this would have appealed to some tweens, but it feels geared more toward older players, which means that this may well have been your grandmother's first experience to an RPG and to manga. See, in Japan, Casino Kid shipped as The $1 Million Kid, a Famicom adaptation of a comic by the same name created by Yuki Ishigaki. Debuting on Famicom in January 1989, Casino Kid landed right in the thick of Dragon Quest III mania. And developer Sofel said, "Why don't we jump on the bandwagon and make a Dragon Quest clone about gambling?" I've never read The $1 Million Kid and I can't find any scans online, but I'm guessing that it was one of those early shonen manga that adopted the tournament arc structure of Dragon Ball and applied it to card games. This game is Akira Toriyama all the way down. The US release of Casino Kid is cut down considerably from the Japanese release, which featured multiple casinos and more in-game events, including slots and roulette. I don't know if that's because of memory limitations and Sofel getting cheap on ROM capacity, or if it has to do with content restrictions on gambling games of pure chance. Unlike poker and blackjack, roulette and slots are purely luck-based and therefore, I suppose, unsuitably degenerate for Americans. I don't know, it's not like Casino Kid is the first gambling video game ever to appear in the US. I covered a bunch of the early ones in the Vegas Slots episode of Game Boy Works Gaiden. But Nintendo had far more control over its system's library and the content that appeared there than Atari or Milton Bradley exerted, even for games that clearly skewed toward an older demographic, although the name Casino Kid does suggest an attempt to appeal to younger players, kind of like Game Boy. So I don't know how to account for the overall strangeness of this release. What I can say definitively is that Casino Kid is the first gambling video game to appear in the US and take the form of a miniature role-playing game, which is also kind of weird, but also pretty on point for this era of Japanese console games. This wandering gambling adventure format goes back at least 2 years to Marionette and Coconuts Japan's Mezase Pachi Pro Pachio-kun for Famicom, a game in which a giant living pachinko ball wanders a pachinko parlor and plays pachinko on different machines. 1989 even saw a spin-off of that series hit Game Boy with Pachinko Time. And the following year, Dragon Quest IV hit Famicom and included, for the first time in the franchise, a casino area, where players could gin up cash by playing slots and poker, in a space that works an awful lot like Casino Kid. So, Sofel clearly did something right here, or at least half right. The casinos in Dragon Quest games work, in my opinion, because they hook into a bigger adventure, and are a mostly optional way to build up some extra cash and earn some rare items. In Casino Kid, there's nothing to the game beyond walking and gambling. You work your way up through the casino ranks by winning cash against increasingly difficult opponents. By increasingly difficult, I mean that they have ever greater quantities of cash on hand and that their facial tells are more difficult to read. There's a hierarchy of opponents to face in the casino, and you're meant to work your way up from the low folks on the totem pole. The blackjack player named Lisa, who has $500 to gamble, and a poker player named Joseph with $1,000 on hand. Trash them, move along to the next competitor, and keep moving up through the challengers until you take out the folks at the top of the food chain. Do well enough, and you will eventually take on the king of the casino, who has $1 million that you have to take possession of, even though he has the benefit of the program code giving him better hands than you. You can record your progress along the way with passwords, so if you, for example, choose to gamble your entire pile in a hand and lose, it's not the end of the world for you. You just have to punch in the password again for a redo. This isn't that much of a game, thanks in large part to all the content cut from the US cartridge, which according to the cutting room floor includes not just roulette and slots, but also multiple alternate casinos that you could visit. The casinos of the Japanese release were kind of merged into a single one here, but not everything carried over. There were all kinds of cutscenes and display images removed, and a load of characters were dropped. Still, even with these excisions, there's still something weird and interesting about Casino Kid. Besides the fact that it introduced casino RPG hybridization to Americans, it also has a goofball personality about it. Many of the people you talk to in the casino offer tips about how to manage different opponents, but the bunny girls and table managers say quirky things, often suggestive things that seem pretty borderline inappropriate for an NES game. And I guess all of this worked for Sofel. They released the sequel, Casino Kid 2, a few years later, toward the end of the console's life. For whatever reason, possibly being that Nintendo no longer really cared much about NES game content by 1993, Casino Kid 2 is a far more faithful localization of the Famicom title. The important thing, of course, is that Casino Kid's success funded the American release of Fish Dude. That's why God put Sofel on this planet in the first place anyway. Rock on, Casino Kid. Rock on, Fish Dude. Next time on NES Works, right in the kisser.